Good evening, everyone. I, Lakshmi Mini, have the honor to welcome you all on behalf of Team Defense Research and Studies, also known as Team DRAS. Team DRAS is a web-based think tank comprising of elite group of veterans, professionals, scholars, and researchers to promote the culture of research, innovation, and associated activities in the country. It is indeed my privilege to present this welcome note and to call in honor the honorable panel of experts. My warm welcome to Lieutenant General KJ Singh, PVSM, Bar to AVSM, Lieutenant General Dipendra Singh Huda, PVSM, UYSM, AVSM, VSM and Bar, ADC, and our beloved moderator, Commodore G. Prakash, Nausena Medal. I also welcome all senior advisors of Team Defense and Defense Research and Studies present with us today, and also our distinguished senior fellows, and my fellow research associates from DRAS. And of course, the strength of our discussion, our beloved audience, and special mention to all the serving and retired flag officers, serving officers, veterans, and students, whoever are present with us today. क्षमाशील हो रिपु समक्ष तुम हुए विनीत जितना ही दुष्ट कौरवों ने तुमको कायर समझा उतना ही सच बोलो तो शर्मे ही बसती है दीप्ति विनय की संधि वचन संपूज्य उसी का जिसमें शक्ति विजय की. The lines I just recited are the apt starter for today's discussion on the topic beyond the surgical strike. And I don't dare to further delay this discussion even by single second because I believe that nobody else can do justice to this topic than the panel of experts we have today. So I now request Megha to introduce our panelists, and I also request all the audience to mute their audio to ensure smooth conduct of the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lakshmi, for that touching welcome speech. It is indeed my esteemed privilege to introduce this elite panel of excellence par excellence. Lieutenant General KJ Singh, Paramavisht Seva Medal, Bharata Ati Vishwa Seva Medal. He was the general officer who commanded the formidable Western Command, an operationally committed corps in the Northeast. He has also commanded an armored division in the Strike Corps, a T-90 armored brigade, and an elite armored regiment. He has also served in counterinsurgency operations in Northeast, J&K, and also with the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Angola. He is currently holding the prestigious Ranjit Singh Chair of Excellence in the Punjab Singh University, Chandigarh. Lieutenant General Dipendra Singh Huda, Vishwa Seva Medal, the Ati Vishwa Seva Medal, and the Uttam Yudh Seva Medal, and the Paramavisht Seva Medal. In this assignment, he handled numerous strategic challenges along the borders both with Pakistan and China. He planned and supervised the successful surgical strike into Pakistan in September 2016. He was also responsible for counter-insurgency operations in Manipur and South Assam. From 2012 to 2016, he was stationed in Jammu and Kashmir, first as the Corps Commander and then as the Army Commander of the Northern Command. And our beloved moderator, Commodore G. Prakash, Nausena Medal, an aviator and a specialist in air warfare and anti-submarine warfare. Commodore Prakash has the honor of commanding 3 warships and 4 naval bases. He has vast experience in operations, training, policy making, and human resource management. He has also served at the Naval Headquarters in New Delhi. May I now request Commodore G. Prakash to kindly take this discussion forward. We also request our audience to text any of your questions for Q&A sessions from the bottom of your screen for saving our precious time. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you, Megha. Can you hear me, Jay?
Yes, sir, loud and clear, sir.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be hosting this event. And we will revisit something that caught the imagination of the nation about 4 years ago. The cross-border strikes of 29 September 2016 in the wake of the Uri attack are more famous as the surgical strike. Now, there's a lot of data available on the net in all kinds of media. Lots of analysis has happened. Lots of questions have been asked over these years. However, it is necessary to continue this process as new answers could emerge to old questions as time and circumstances go by. I have divided this 40 minutes into roughly 3 sections. In the first 10 minutes, we'll have a look at the past, and then we will have look at the present, how we are arrayed, and we'll have a look at the future. So I will cut to the chase straight away and start with the person who planned and executed the operation, General Huda. Sir, now what were our military strategic aims at the time of the cross-border strikes? Were these aims achieved? And why do we continue to have trouble with Pakistan? Is there anything that we could have done differently? General Huda, sir.
So thank you. This is a question which is very often asked. What were the aims? And I think from our perspective, the primary aim was to send a very strong message to Pakistan that there is going to be a cost to your adoption of these methods by which you are sending terrorists across into our area. Is there some issue with my audio? Hello? Is the audio okay?
Okay,
Yes,
sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay, thank you. So the idea was to send a very strong message that there is going to be some cost associated with using terrorists in our territory, and the fact that we were, violating the sovereignty of a country, the fact that we were crossing the border, these are actually strong signals as far as independent countries are concerned. You will recall that after the strike in Myanmar, which had happened the previous year, Pakistan had said something like this cannot happen as far as our territory is concerned. There was also, Prakash, an element of retribution. We had lost 18 soldiers, and therefore, some cost had to be conveyed on the other side too. With these sort of objectives, did we achieve what we set out to achieve? And I think we did, because the strikes were successful. We went across. There was great shock on the Pakistan side. And I think it was because of that shock that, they just refused to accept that anything like this had happened. They completely said, no surgical strike has happened. Nobody's come and crossed over into our territory. So in that sense, I think, we were quite successful in conveying our message. I think where the problem was that, people started looking at it as a much more ambitious, kind of viewpoint. That you've done this surgical strike, but, Pakistan still continues to carry out terror activities. So what did you actually achieve? And I like to give this example, in this. So the killing of Osama bin Laden didn't kill off Al-Qaeda, did it? It didn't. Does it mean that the attempt should also not have been made? So I think there is some signaling that needs to go on. One part of deterrence is your ability to be credibly communicate your intent to the adversary. And so I think we did that. As I said, people started looking at it in a much more sort of ambitious way, once the strikes had gone on. Also for the reason that, it caught the political sort of imagination. So people started ascribing larger motives. When we were planning it, it was never a thought in our mind that by doing this operation, Pakistan is suddenly going to stop doing all terrorist activities. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, sir. Over to General Kamaljeet Singh, sir.
I fully endorse what General Huda is saying, and I would like to take the issue a little forward. What has unfortunately happened is that while military commanders like General Huda are very clear in their aims, and they have actually achieved it also, unfortunately, there has been coupling of internal and external narratives. So, in order to draw out political mileage, in order to pander to local lobbies, we have somehow mixed up our communication. And unfortunately, in info-war domain, we seem to have not succeeded. See, in exchange like this, if Pakistan does manage a situation of stalemate, then obviously the victory is of Pakistan. Even if in the perception domain, unfortunately in perception domain, Pakistan seems to have at least brought up to 60-40, maybe in our favor. But they have achieved 40, and 40 is now very close to 50. So internationally, people do not give us a clear head over Pakistan. That is where somehow our information warfare experts have failed. And allow me to build on this theme a little more. Unfortunately, what happens in our country is that we do not treat defense issues or strategic issues in the manner they should be treated. After all, when Parakram happened, Vajpayee ji said, "Khatre ke badal mandra rahe hain." And later, when Ziaul Haq made that speech, he said, "Badal chhat gaye hain." Now, in strategy, you cannot use meteorological kind of unsound kind of comparisons. Unfortunately, we are just doing that. I'm sorry, I'd be a little critical on this issue. You see the movies that were made, Udi, the serial Avrodh, all of them give a very funny account of how such operations take place. Why aren't we able to sort of remain centered to our core message, which, like General Huda has said, that it's signaling? Why should we mix it up with number of people killed? Some leaders later after Balakot said so many people died, and then Pakistan managed to take some journalists, show some hillsides, trees. And today, unfortunately, we have not been able to, our messages got mixed up, not because in our execution. Our execution was faultless. It was very, very sort of, I must say, something which hasn't happened earlier. That kind of execution has taken place. But people who have to take the information signaling across, they have not delivered. And because of that, there is this haze which is come into it. So I'll leave it at that. I would say that great operation, great intent, audacious, signaling right, yet our people who build up the narrative try to extract wrong messaging out of it. Because our thing was very clear that we can do it. We'll violate your territory. We'll go at terrorist camps. And we will operate below the nuclear threshold. But instead of focusing there, we have gone to the wrong domain. So because of that, unfortunately, in info domain, we have not achieved what we had set out to achieve.
Sir, General KJ Singh, I'll ask you a linked question. Now, we know that similar operations have happened in the past, and there are such statements in the parliament that it has happened before. But then, unlike the previous times when it was not overtly owned up, this time, there was a lot of publicity for it. Now, my question is, when the other side also knew that these things had happened before, what was the conclusions that they would have come to with the fact that this time there was overt owning up publicity for the event?
See, Commodore Prakash, we have very strangely lived with a kind of template that Nathula happened in 1967, we didn't own up. It was a great success in our country, but we have not yet owned up. We call it border skirmish. So this tendency to somehow build in a deniability clause, and this is propelled by our so-called foreign policy mandarins, who somehow tend to give this thing that let us keep it below the threshold, things will get resolved. Operational issues, I think in their articulation should remain clear. So it's a great credit to this government that it did not keep the deniability part, it owned up. And the message has gone across. It has gone across very clearly. Like General Huda says,
General KJ Singh, sir, your audio has gone off. General Huda sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I think we have lost General KJ Singh's audio there. So I will just end this section with one little question to General Huda sir. Now deterrence being at the core of the entire cross-border strike. Now could you make a short comment on how successful have you been in achieving deterrence?
So I think, when you look at deterrence, you have to look at capability, credibility, and your intent to communicate, very, very clearly to Pakistan what we're doing. And while we've had the capability, I think somehow, as even KJ is bringing out, our ability to credibly, position ourselves and our ability to clearly communicate our intent. I think what we've done is we haven't had a very consistent policy as far as Pakistan is concerned. And so sometimes it is, let's talk to them. Sometimes it is, let us not at all talk to them. So unless you have a consistent policy that combines, whatever are your powers, your economic potential, your diplomatic influence, along with your military capability, capability maybe in a limited way, but surely we need to use it in order to pressurize Pakistan.
Sir.
We can achieve some deterrence.
Thank you, sir. I'll continue with you. Now, coming to the present, now what is the current prognosis for, say, inimical action from Pakistan, and how are we poised to tackle it?
So, Prakash, the point is, there is deep-rooted hostility in Pakistan Army with regard to India. It's not something new. It's been there right from the independence. The way Pakistan Army looks at, India is that there is an ideological and religious struggle that is going on between the two countries. That is a Hindu India versus a Muslim Pakistan. That's how they frame their, sort of ideological narrative. If you also see General Kidwai in the IISS, recently gave a talk, I think it was in February. And he says, it's our responsibility in Pakistan to ensure strategic stability in South Asia. And for doing this, we have to contest India militarily and also in the nuclear domain. So that's the kind of attitudes that Pakistan Army has with regard to India. It's a very sort of, I would say, deep-rooted kind of hostility. Are we likely to see any change? I can see change can be driven either internally within Pakistan or due to external pressure. Neither seems to be happening. The political leadership in Pakistan is extremely weak, and therefore I don't see any internal drivers that will, force Pakistan Army to change its behavior. In fact, Pakistan Army is one of the most trusted institutions of Pakistan. And as far as externally is concerned, if you are in Pakistan's shoes and you look around and you see Afghanistan seems to be coming our way, the Americans want our support, to pull out from there. They look at our side and they say, look, Kashmir is a bit, unstable. It's on the sort of boil. And therefore, it's not as if we are completely sort of losing. And therefore, what is the need to change our path? So I think these are some of the, drivers that are driving Pakistan Army. And I don't, unfortunately, see, at least in the short term, anything that will make Pakistan Army change its behavior. And so we are in for an unstable sort of, line of control. And as we are seeing, in fact, today, 4,000 ceasefire violations this year, just enormous. So unfortunately, I don't see any change in that for now.
Hi, sir. General KJ Singh, welcome back.
Thank you. Sorry,
Can you hear me,
sir?
General KJ Singh, sir?
Yeah, I can hear you, sir.
Okay, sir.
I can hear you, sir.
Okay, I can hear you also. I'm coming to you, sir. Haven't we already called Pakistan's nuclear bluff several times? And how much scope because of that do you see today for conventional operations below the nuclear threshold?
See, earlier in Jal Huda had also brought out that world is changing on various parameters. So while we have called off our nuclear bluff, there are other changes which are taking place. So agreed, there is space below the nuclear threshold. It is there. But whether you can prosecute a conventional war of the variety that Indian Army has been used to in planes is highly questionable. The best probably you can do is swift, surgical, shallow till about operational depth operations. It may not be possible. See, when I was a divisional commander commanding an armored division, the line that I used to prosecute is that my aim is to sort of cause such a psychological collapse in Pakistan army. And how I intended to do was to destroy a significant part of their Army Reserve South or Army Reserve North, which are two strategic forces they have got. Now, to think of doing that is very difficult. We have somehow moved into the sphere of hybrid warfare. There are other domains which have become relevant, like cyber, and maybe later space will become relevant. So there is space. We have helped to define it also, but that space has to be used in a very nuanced manner. We can't go for the operations which used to be thought of when we were divisional commanders, that you launch armored divisions and go into Pakistan and touch their operational depth. That is unlikely. But we will have to continue to somehow sharpen our punitive capability to discover weapon systems which can give that surgical kind of message, and hope that, and then combine other domains like warfare on sea, air, and cyber, and convey that strong signaling to Pakistan to resist. But like Jal Huda says, we are in for a long haul. It's not easy to, there are a lot of people I meet nowadays who say as if Pakistan is no more, Pakistan is a failed state, failing state. Well, all that is not true. Pakistan has relevance. Pakistan is a necessary evil. We have learned to live with it. And somehow we have to, we can't just say we can't engage, we shouldn't engage with Pakistan. We have to find out some methods to engage with them. And we also have to solve our problems, not by in a security format, but we have to apply socio-political factors. So if we want to resolve the proxy war in Kashmir, security forces will give you a platform. But beyond that, it has to be done by the politicians, by the opinion makers, social leaders, theological leaders. They have to take the thing forward.
Thank you, sir. Sir, General Huda, sir, I'll ask you a linked question. With the current situation with China on the LAC, how much of collusive support do you think will manifest on ground? If we have to do a response to a punitive response to Pakistan now?
So Prakash, I mean, it's clear that there is a great deal of collusivity between China and Pakistan. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt, and therefore we need to be prepared for it. But I think when we look at it practically, I mean, the situation that you are painting, that there's a terrorist attack where the fingerprints are from Pakistan and India does a punitive strike. What will China do? My own sense is, they are not going to come in overt military support of Pakistan. And the reason why I say this is, for them to be supporting something which has links with terrorism, is I'm not sure something that they will do. Indirect pressure, yes, of the kind that they are doing, try and do some, movements, try and do some incursions, etc., to stave off some pressure. But I don't see them coming openly, in support. If it escalates and, Pakistan comes under, greater military pressure, then you could possibly see, greater moves from China. Because the fact is, obviously, they wouldn't want Pakistan to suffer a completely sort of, humiliating kind of defeat. But I think of the kind of actions that we are talking about, responding to terrorist strikes, punitive strikes, I don't see China directly sort of doing anything. And I think my last point is, even for our planning purposes, let's say there's a terrorist strike and we want to respond to Pakistan. For us to start thinking that, what will China do? And therefore, should I or should I not carry out this activity? I think will be dangerous for our strategic thinking. Because if we don't respond, then you might just find Pakistan getting encouraged. So that's my sense of it.
Thank you, sir. Just staying on a link issue, sir. Currently, the Chinese appear to be keeping us engaged on the land border, and that too in sectors where I suppose they have the advantage. And do you think they really understand our propensity to be terra-centric in our thought process and tie us down to land so that we don't pay adequate attention at other places where they may have vulnerabilities, like at sea, for example?
Is that for me, Prakash?
That's for you, sir. That's for you, sir.
See, I think in some ways what you're saying is right, but I think there is also a reality. The reality is that the problem that we have with China is along our borders. It's an unsettled border. And therefore, that is where they find an opportunity to put pressure on you. And no country, no sovereign nation can accept, your borders getting violated or your perception of the border. And therefore, I think the focus on the LAC has to remain, and it is there. As far as the sea is concerned and the Indian Ocean, we have a tremendous geographical advantage over the PLA Navy, and I think we need to utilize it. I'm for one saying that we need to invest much more in our naval forces. We need to invest. What kind of capabilities, we can keep debating. Should it be an undersea fleet? Should it be aircraft carriers? A different thing. But I think the advantages that we have over the PLA Navy in the Indian Ocean is something that needs to be exploited. But the point I'm making, Prakash, is it's not either or. That, if you're focusing on the land borders, you can't focus on the sea, or if you're going to focus on the sea, then you can't focus on the land borders. I think both areas, have their own sort of strategic value.
Okay, sir. We'll go on to look at the future, sir. I'll go to General KJ Singh. Sir, like it happened during Op Parakram, when we have a conflict, we amass a lot of troops there, a lot of equipment on the borders, and then. But isn't that a bit outdated? I mean, the currently concluded Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict, I understand, and lots of the use of drones and modern technology by Azerbaijan, which they sourced from Turkey, is credited to have led to Armenia virtually buckling. Now, don't you think this kind of a shift in the way that we should be fighting? Now, isn't there a need to quickly shift that way? And with the current relations of the Pakistanis with Turkey, even in their state of penury, it's possible that they may, acquire these. So how do we shift? How do we cater for all this?
Commodore Prakash, see, sir, it is like this, that what China has done in Ladakh, at Galwan, Depsang, and all these areas, is a form of coercive deployment. They came in the garb of an exercise. They did not see the response from us, and they have solidified. So for us to think that coercive moves or in the garb of exercise, people will not resort to this may not be entirely safe for us with neighbors like what we have. So we should keep our antennas up, and we cannot say that China will not do it, say in central sector or in Sikkim or Arunachal. So coercive, and China is not fired. China is only Galwan has happened where 20 of our boys were martyred and unspecified numbers of China. Otherwise, it has just been a coercive kind of a push. We've also pushed forward south of Pangong Tso. So, but coming to your core question about this technology bit, while I fully support your contention that in future technology is going to become increasingly relevant, I will say that, but it's not going to be immediate terms because there are few things. One is you cannot use the Middle East template onto an exchange where Indian soldiers are involved. China is, I'm not bringing in China, I'm saying Indian soldiers are involved. Why I'm saying this? See, the maximum number of T-72 tanks have been knocked out in Syria, not in this round, earlier rounds in 1973 and other operations thereafter. So should we have not bought T-72s? No. Basically, it is how the weapon is utilized. If in Azerbaijan or Nagorno-Karabakh, you put all your tanks in a lager, harbor kind of situation, which has been outdated in Indian Army, I don't know how many years back. So there are few factors. One is, let us not completely transpose ill-trained army scenario onto our army. We cater for dispersion. We cater for proper kind of tactical and other measures. Secondly, to have these drones in these many numbers and operate them with 100% efficiency, even about 70% efficiency in high altitude is highly questionable. Whatever we have seen till now about technology is largely in psychological domain. That microwave oven was switched on, that drones were flying noodles to Chinese soldiers. We haven't seen evidence of it happening practically. And for Chinese army not to use it if they had it will not be correct for us to, because they came in a broadcasting mode. Everything was displayed to be picked up by satellite. So, well, capabilities are possible. I'm not denying that. They will surely come in. We should be vigilant. We should ginger up our technological advancement, build countermeasures. But for us to think that it will happen in this exchange, I think, no, I don't think it will happen in this exchange. In this exchange, whatever weapons had to roll out have probably got rolled out. China wouldn't have held back a thing which is a decider, and especially in areas of Pangong Tso. So I would tend to believe that in future, definitely. How soon? Well, I can't answer that question with conclusive sort of conviction, but I can definitely say that we still have space, and with good operational hygiene. And I'm sure there are measures, if we have grouped our air defense elements and others. I'm not saying that tanks are, I'm neither saying tanks are obsolete, nor am I saying that we should recklessly invest in this mechanized kind of this thing. We need to have agile platforms suitably grouped with their defensive measures. And but we should not be quick to jettison this. We should play out the whole thing. That's how I'll see it.
Thanks, sir. General Huda, sir, now would you like to comment on the use of technology in the recent just that part, and how quickly can we shift? Do we need to shift?
See, we do need to shift. When you're talking of war fighting, obviously it's a combination of many things. I mean, your capabilities, your doctrine, your training standards, the quality of human resource, what tactics do you employ? So all of that. I think as we go forward in future, technology is going to become more and more important. I mean, people talked about the RMA revolution in military affairs after the Gulf War. And then after that, people said, see, we talked about RMA, but see what's happened to the American army in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc., etc. But I think when you look at the way technology is changing today, what we're talking about, the fourth industrial revolution, disruptive technologies, I think you are going to, see them play an increasingly greater role. And I will just identify 2, 3. General KJ talked about cyber, artificial intelligence. I don't know, you would have read recently, I think 2 months back, there was a dogfight between AlphaGo, an artificial intelligence, and an actual F-16 pilot. And the pilot lost 5-0 in a dogfight. So there are applications. I'm not saying, it will replace a pilot. Artificial intelligence, robotics, unmanned systems. I think these are some disruptive technologies that we in India need to start seriously looking at. It will take time to incorporate, but certainly I think our level of technology, frankly, if you ask me, in the Indian military is very low and just needs to change.
Thank you, sir. Again, staying with you, sir. You have written a draft national security strategy document in the past, and we still do not have a formal document of that kind. So, how much do you think that affects, policy making on national security related issues?
It tremendously affects policy making because you don't have a base document on which you can, then craft out your policy. So what does the national security strategy do? It's just telling all organs of the government that this is what our vision is. This is what our thinking about, internal security issues, regional issues, international issues is, and therefore everybody must pull together. For the military, it's the basic for your, defense review or your defense strategy, a national defense strategy, which will then guide everything from your doctrines to your force structures, to whatever reforms that need to be undertaken by the military. So without this base document, I also think a national security strategy puts some constraints on the political leadership. That this is what you have said, and it makes them follow a consistent path. And I think that's one reason, why the political leadership sometimes, doesn't want a national security strategy, because they say, oh, it will tie us down. There is surely enough flexibility. But in the absence of a national security strategy, I'm afraid, we are going to have, flip-flop kind of attitude. Consistency is not going to be there. A lot of things are going to be sort of personality based, only talked about in the media, exploited in the media, exploit your social media. So I think it's essential, and it's a country the size of India, a country which wants to become a global player. For us to be shy of articulating what our national security strategy is, I think it's a shame. And General KJ can come in on this if you want.
Thanks, sir. I will fully support you, and I would also tend to put a point for this thing, that it is also because we don't want to hold ourselves accountable. When we were in Perspective Planning Directorate, there were quantified models. We had defined that with Pakistan, we want to have punitive deterrence. With China, we want to graduate from dissuasive to credible deterrence. Now, all those in terms of asymmetries are defined. There are quantifiable parameters. So a country like India must lay down these parameters, hold itself accountable, This is a new fad India has picked up, ambiguity. We will not tell. It keeps other side confused. Well, sir, allow me to submit. It also keeps our own side confused. Because, see, when we were in army as senior commanders, we were told that to reduce complexity is your first job. You should remain predictable to your command. Your command should exactly know what will be your next move. So if ambiguities are policy, it's a very dangerous situation. And other thing is, can in an age where both sides, and by both sides, even China, all two of our neighbors have nuclear weapons, can we choose to remain ambiguous? If deterrence can only be achieved if we define our red lines. So I would not only go along with General Huda, sir, I would say it is, you may not follow it. After all, China has also laid down certain things. China never said they'll come like this into Ladakh. You don't have to lay out those things down. But you need to have some kind of a national security strategy so that people are held accountable, systems work to a plan, and everybody knows what is to be done.
So staying with General KG Singh, taking a more whole picture of this entire thing, there are reports, credible reports that Pakistan is going to hand over certain islands of the Sindh coast and the Balochistan coast to the Chinese. Now that's a very legal process. Anyone can sell off land to anybody, and we know how the Chinese can be very creative when they use little barren islands. So now, how does this change the strategic situation for us? And again, how does our perennial focus on land get affected with this kind of a very serious?
See, Commodore Prakash, sir, I had an advantage of doing naval staff course. So whatever little study I have done of Pakistan's coast, I strongly feel Gwadar is not required by Pakistan. This is, Pakistan has enough ports, Karachi, Pasni, Ormara, Jivani, they have enough ports and naval bases. Gwadar. Gwadar is, like they say, that CPEC is for China, by China, of China, and Pakistan just happens to be there. So in this game of CPEC, mounting debts have led to a situation where Pakistan doesn't know how to pay back those debts. So these two islands, which is Buddo and Bandal, actually names are very amusing for us. It sounds more like Buddu and Bandal. So these two islands of Sindh coast, they were actually being given to American companies, like the Bandal Island, definitely, where Thomas Kramer was in some kind of talks with Malik Riaz, and they were even planning to make the tallest building of world on that island. Such plans were being negotiated. So that was commercial part. Now it appears that Americans have lost interest and Chinese have stepped in. And Chinese would use the commercial part, may also use it for bulk breaking, and bigger containers come and they are transferred to smaller, all those kind of things. There are issues. Sindh government is up in arms. It is a worrying sign for us. It is definitely a worrying sign for us. And earlier part, Commodore Prakash, you had mentioned, sir, about this Pakistan trying to hedge through China. I remember when Prakram was taking place, when we used to plan, we were told that on one particular Pakistani airbase, I think Jacobabad, there were American assets. So you couldn't even think of factoring into your planning. So such Chinese presence which is taking place in various forums, like making a dam at Kohala, by making another dam, Daimar Basha, by having these islands, Gwadar, by putting their personnel, does constrict our opinion, our options creates challenges for us. So it is worrying. In the sense, we hope that the Sindh government is able to raise the flag and put some check on it. But it appears the Chinese will probably, with the kind of debts they have put on Pakistan, may grab these two islands. And these are just for people who may not have, I picked them from Wikipedia. Bandel is about 120 square kilometer and Budo is 60 square kilometers. Small islands, twin islands, have multiple potentials in terms of fishing, in terms of marine produces. So China is actively working in this direction. And Commodore Prakash, you are a naval expert of great repute. You may be able to garnish this little submission.
So it's not a little submission, it's a big hypothesis. No, I would just make this little comment that one of the biggest things that besets Chinese when they operate in the Indian Ocean is the lack of MR, maritime reconnaissance. Now, international law makes it imperative that if the Pakistanis allow their airfields to be used for the Chinese to operate their planes, then they become a legitimate target for us in a conflict. However, if these islands are handed over to the Chinese and it becomes their property, and then they are very much within their rights to operate the aircraft from there, and that does not bring Pakistan into the firing line as per law. So I will leave it at that, sir. Just one last question from me to General Hooda, sir. Now, again thinking on the longer term. Now, making our national power, gaining a lot of national power is very important. At the end of the day, that is what gives you the strength. Now, is there a lesson to be taken from the way the Chinese went after it, of biding your time, lying low? Is it really possible in our kind of politics, our kind of democracy, to really treat Pakistan with benign neglect for say 2 decades? And then concentrate on gaining your national strength. And thereafter, maybe the whole thing, the equations may completely change and they become irrelevant. Your comments, sir, your short comments, please.
So, there are some things to learn from the Chinese, how, as you're talking about, they kept quiet, they bided their time. Today, even the Americans are surprised and saying, the Chinese exploited us. And that they have become powerful, it's only at our expense. They also kept their, sort of borders quiet and settled and safe. Unfortunately, in our case, there are two issues where we are different. One is, I think, the way our, political system is, long-term thinking, thinking 10, 15, 20 years, down the line is it becomes almost impossible, and particularly when you have political systems that are so sharply divided and so sort of against each other, that there is no consistency in in national security policy or economic development and things like that. I think the second thing is benign neglect with Pakistan, unfortunately, is not possible. There wasn't a neighbor with China which was so actively hostile as Pakistan is. Even countries which had problems like Japan, etc. I mean, they were heavily trading with them, and there were linkages, etc. In our case, Prakash, my sense is you cannot neglect any of our neighbors. I mean, which is our smallest neighbor? Our smallest neighbor is Bhutan. And can we just, not think about Bhutan and just say, okay, let it go? No, because you have Bhutan bordering China. There's a border issue with China. And so what happens, China-Bhutan relations has a big impact on us. Similarly with Nepal, we can say it's a landlocked country, so badly dependent on us. So I think we need to take our neighbors along with us. There was a feeling, a few years ago that India's development, India's economic rise can actually drive prosperity in South Asia. And therefore, all our smaller neighbors are going to come towards us. And, there will be greater linkages. My own sense, and I may be wrong, my own sense is that in the last few years, we have, while we talk about, greater integration of South Asia, our own policies are very restrictive against immigration, against free flow of people. All this talk about people are going to come into India and they will infiltrate into our country and spread here. I don't think we have taken the region along as the biggest country. And that's something I think we need to sort of look at and review. So if we want to sort of rise as a national power, we have to take our neighbors along. Otherwise, we are going to always be looking at them with suspicion because they will go to China. China will provide them, sort of greater economic benefits. That's the reality.
Thank you, sir. I am shifting to the audience questions. We got about hardly 10 minutes now. There is this question which I'm also amending it a little bit. Now that you have said that, it's reality that we have to constantly keep managing a neighbor like Pakistan. There is no other option. Then when carrot and stick doesn't work, then you have to ensure that there's pain and pressure somewhere else. So your Balakot strikes came, say, 2 years after the 16 attack, and should it have been then logically been followed up with more such acts so that the correct kind of signaling was given?
So Prakash, my sense, as I said this earlier, I think we need a much more comprehensive kind of approach. To say that it is only going to be a stick, and that every time there is some terrorist act, we are going to employ a military force across the border, and that's the way things will happen. I think when you're looking at relations between countries, you should also be aware of what the other country is willing to pay in costs. So it isn't as if you do some strike and Pakistan is going to fold and everything is going to become okay. So I think we need to have a comprehensive policy. Dialogue, I think, is something that we should not completely rule out. Diplomatic engagement, economic pressure. The FATF is one pressure area. Pakistan's economy is in doldrums. I think we need a more comprehensive approach of how to deal with Pakistan and a much more consistent approach. Don't expect short-term results. All this is good for social media. We have done this, we've done one strike, and we've done. But I think if we really want to look at Pakistan, we need a more consistent approach. And my last point is, we also need to look internally, Prakash. Why are we providing them conditions so that they can fish in troubled waters? If you sort out Kashmir politically, if things calm down there, a lot of the problems between India and Pakistan will go away. And that sorting out Kashmir to a large part is the Indian government's responsibility. So I think that's how we need to look at it in a more comprehensive manner.
Thank you, sir. The next question is to both of you, actually. When you talk about modernization, how do we see new thought processes, documents coming out regularly? How do we make our the procurement process more nimble? And making that nimble is not enough, actually. Budgetary support, assured budgetary support is important. And you have all kind of news floating around in the media about various constraints that is faced for money for the armed forces. Now, these don't convey a great picture to an enemy. So how do we handle this whole thing of A, budgetary support, B, nimbleness of the procurement process?
KJ, will you go first, KJ?
Yes, I was looking after capability building also when I was ADG PP. Basically, our problem is that we are getting exalted on very strange things. Just announcing something and we get happy. Like making a procurement manual is it a means or is it an end? We seem to be very excited that we took 2-3 years and then we put into place a procurement manual, and then that was not approved. Then we got into another spin after Manohar Parrikar, and now it has taken us 6 years to make a defense procurement policy. And there is great amount of joy, exultation taking place. Listen, we have to make it work. That's the problem. There has to be a sense of ownership. And frankly speaking, I am very sorry to share my little cynicism on few issues. We have, defense exhibition. It used to take place in Delhi. Of course, Pragati Maidan had to be repaired. But then we started a political journey. We took it to Goa, then we took it to Chennai, then we are taking it to Lucknow. So is procurement also about, if we have our way, we even wanted to take the air show out of Bangalore. So these industrial corridors, lot of these things are frankly, still not being done in the correct way. We are forced into a situation where we are only looking at strategic procurement like of Rafale variety, that government to government, or what we have taken ultralight howitzers from USA, or emergency procurement of sniper rifles and assault rifles and all from on that route. So we have to make this work. Unfortunately, we are not able to do it. There is hardly any accountability of other organs. Okay, Navy does it better than Army, but what? Army has to be also made to do it. And without budgetary support, it can't happen. If we are looking for some revolutionary ideas, then one thing which we need to debate in our think tank is, should we in India have theaterized procurement? Okay, economy of scales is a great thing, but Indian Northern Command is bigger than many armies of the world, or like Western Air Command is bigger than many air forces in the world. So when you try to acquire a weapon system or an armament which is customized to all the terrains, you end up doing multiple trials and it fails on some parameter or the other, and such inter-theater movement of weapons is not taking place. Not in our context at least. So we are not also going for out-of-area contingency operations of that variety. So should we look at making it more manageable? So these are some thoughts that I'll leave it, but without budget, nothing can happen. If you are not going to put money, you can't build up capability. That's not possible.
Thank you, sir. General Huda, sir.
Yeah, so I completely agree with what General KJ has said. I'll just add two quick thoughts. He talked about the acquisition process and how we get excited. Acceptance of necessity has been given for so many 1,000 crore. That equipment doesn't come. So one is, how do we speed up our acquisitions? So you'd be surprised. The US Air Force Chief recently said, I want to use technology, high-end technology in 3 areas. And one of those areas was how to speed up the acquisition process, which is going to take you 10 years to induct, systems. So that's one area we need to look at. Secondly, when we are talking of, restructuring and reform, I think it needs to be a quiet debate between the 3 services and the CDS. Unfortunately, there is just too much going out in the media. I mean, why should proposals come out in the media? I mean, is anybody trying to pressurize somebody else? So even the recent pension thing you see. So something which is proposed by the CDS is out in the social media. The next day, some note which is meant for the Chief of Naval Staff is out in the social media. I'm afraid this is not the way we are going to restructure and reform. So if the 3 services, chiefs and the CDS can sit together, not try and say, I'm the boss, I thumb the table, so therefore what I'm saying is right. and try and take everybody along. I think that would be a good way. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening now. We are seeing more divisions actually than consensus on issues of restructuring and reform.
Thank you, sir. I think we'll have one last question that's from the audience. We started in Kashmir, so we'll end in Kashmir. The question is whether there is still a window for soft power to be used to supplement the hard power which is in operation in the Kashmir Valley. That's a question for the audience, sir. You could both make a short comments on that, sir.
Okay, so let me go first. I think the need today is only for soft power, Prakash. I mean, what are we saying? There are 200 terrorists in the valley. That's it. I mean, to handle 200 terrorists, I mean, what hard power really? I mean, more than what we already have do we require? At its peak in 2001, the number of terrorists killed in 1 year was 2,500. So now when you have 200 terrorists there, I think there is, we are focusing too much on how many terrorists we need to kill, etc. So the need is for soft power. The need is to see how we can take, the people along with us. I know it's not easy. There is radicalization in society and all that is there. So those are the challenges I think that we need to be focusing on. How do we get, political movement and politics back in the valley, and that takes center stage, rather than just terrorism, anti-Indian, Pakistani. So if you ask me, I think the greater need today is for soft power, a much better narrative, by the government that appeals and reaches out, particularly to the youth of Kashmir. And then see how it goes. Again, I'm saying there are no easy, quick solutions, but we can build slowly on that. You can keep killing terrorists, the 20, 30, 100 every year. I'm not sure that's going to make a transformational change.
I'll only add one thing, that we should quietly work on long-term measures like. Now we are working on building reservoirs on Chenab River. We are working on Ravi, on Shahpur Kandi Dam. So we would be able to optimize water that is allocated to us. And that is going to create problems and challenges for Pakistan. It is coercion, long term, because it can't, reservoirs don't come up in an year, or it takes nearly a decade. It takes 6 to 7 years to make such kind of reservoirs. So we have to remain committed and focused without making too much song, dance, and drama about it. As regards use of soft power is concerned, culture like ours must feel confident. We should allow, and this is not going to be short term. It will take generations, but let soft power exchange carry on. Let negotiations also take place. And we can apply hard power also, because that is what is the smart power. You have to have combination of various measures. So for us to, unfortunately, like what General Hooda also brought out, we should not think tactical, that we will have overnight results and we will do it everything with a stick. It will not happen. We'll have to use a slew of measures. Some of them may not even bear result, but they'll have to be worked. So our focus has to somehow be on multiple initiatives. And I 200% endorse his line of thinking that if we internally resolve situation in Kashmir, then it doesn't give it limits the chance for Pakistan to fish in troubled waters. So we must apply ourselves socio-culturally, politically, theologically, resolve the problem there, and that is where the solution lies.
Thank you very much, sir. At the cost of sounding like a TV anchor, I would say that we are completely run out of time. The aim of this discussion was to actually keep it to the military strategic level, and we actually stayed there. And I must really thank both the panelists for keeping it like that. I know there is too much that you can say, and there is too much to ask in this topic, and 45 minutes aren't anywhere near close enough. But that was a wonderful set of inputs from you, gentlemen. So then these are chaotic times, and international rivalries rage around us, even in the midst of a global pandemic like it happened 100 years ago. So conflict is perennial, whatever the circumstances, and makes it imperative for governments to always keep national security, whatever be the conditions in front of them. And that takes much thought and action. And I think that's what both of you effectively said. And I'm sure that we will get there. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Over to Nikita Vats for the vote of thanks. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Commodore Prakash. I am honored to have this opportunity to thank today's speakers, Lieutenant General KJ Singh and Lieutenant General DS Hooda, who had graciously agreed to share their thoughts and insights on surgical strikes. It was a wonderful experience to listen to you. I also take this opportunity to thank our moderator, Commodore G. Prakash, for planning and executing this panel discussion in a meticulous and professional manner. We all love the way you put in the effort, sir. I would also like to thank the senior advisors, senior fellows, and researchers of DRAS and other guests of the audience for their participation and involvement in this session. Thank you to Lakshmi and Megda for the refreshing welcome address and introduction. And my special thanks to Commander Jaikrishnan N. Nair for encouraging and supporting our webinar team comprising Lakshmi, Megda, Divya, Purnima, and me for the successful culmination. Last but not the least, I'm thankful to DRAS for providing a platform to discuss and engage on a very relevant and important matter concerning the security of our nation. We look forward to having all of your esteemed presence in our future programs and events. With this, let's call it a day. Thank you and good night.